Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're excited that so many of you could join us today for Laziness Does Not Exist. I'm Jason MacArthur, the events coordinator for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, Devon Price and Kendra Diaz-Ford, and then we'll get right to the conversation. Kendra Diaz-Ford is program director and assistant professor in the Integral and Transpersonal Psychology program at CIIS. As a scholar practitioner, she comes from years of professional experience deeply rooted in the field of mental health, which included casework, housing advocacy, and social activism. Kendra now focuses on her work as a transformative educator and transpersonal researcher, where she is committed to supporting scholarly excellence and guiding learners to connect deeply into their innate wisdom and individual gifts to grow personally, spiritually, and professionally. Devon Price is a social psychologist, writer, activist, and professor at Loyola University of Chicago School of Continuing and Professional Studies. Price's work has appeared in numerous publications such as the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Slate, The Rumpus, NPR, and HuffPost, and has been featured on the front page of Medium numerous times. They live in Chicago, Illinois. And now, let me turn it over to Kendra and Devon.
Hi, Devin. I'm really excited about our conversation this evening.
Hello, good evening. Thanks for having me and doing this.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to sort of dive in pretty broadly so that we can kind of really go into some of the places that maybe you want to go this evening around, the topics that you explore in your book. And I'm curious if you can just start us out in talking about what is the laziness lie that you discuss in your book.
Sure, yeah. The laziness lie is a term that I put on this pretty pervasive cultural belief system that has its roots in Puritanism and white supremacy in the US, but it's kind of spread everywhere, and it's tainted not just our approach to work, but our view of so many things, our boundaries, our ability to listen to our bodies, all of these different pervasive problems, and just kind of moralizing work. And it has three major tenets. And the first one is that your worth is defined by your productivity. The second tenet is that you can't trust your needs, your limitations, any feelings that tell you that you need to slow down or change course. And then the third tenet is that there's always more that you could be doing. And like I said, it's not just work necessarily, but it's does your body look the correct way? Do you have, are you presenting yourself in a professional enough way? Are you doing enough activism? Pretty much any realm of life you can be made to feel lazy about.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about it in all these different areas of life because sometimes when we're talking about productivity, I mean, I know my mind first goes to work, right? Am I being productive in my work? But there's all these other ways in which it plays out in our lives. And I'm wondering if you want to talk about that a little bit more, kind of what that looks like.
Sure. So one thing that I like to stress and encourage people to think about is if you live under a worldview that says work and productivity makes you a good person, taking a lot of things on and achieving a lot of good things makes you a good person, and it's immoral to be lazy. Think about how that really distorts your relationship to consent and your ability to say no to really anything. We're really starting with a cultural frame that saying yes to something is morally superior to saying no, and that stopping something, not being able to do something, not wanting to do something is something that you kind of have to justify. So that really phrase more than just sexual consent, which normally when we talk about consent, that's
Mhm.
the forefront in people's minds, but your commitments to people that you're in relationships with, your commitment to family members and expectations that they place on you, that some of them might be things that don't actually align with your values and who you really are and who you want to be. And like I said, activism, overcommitting to the point of burnout Or I think this is even really closely tied to the problem of performative activism, that people want to be good, they want to be virtuous, they want to satisfy that nagging impulse in the back of their mind that they're not doing enough to solve these huge pressing problems. And so they reach for the first available thing that they can do without kind of thinking about, is this something that the group that I'm advocating for actually wants? Is this a sustainable commitment? Is this something that I can really follow through with and that's going to be good for me as well as the causes and the communities that I'm trying to serve? So it's really pervasive. I talk in the book also about things like parenting guilt. I think that's a major battleground where no matter what you do, you're going to be criticized, and you face so much real and internalized social judgment that you're not checking off all of these boxes and scheduling all these activities, training your kid to have all these various skills. And yeah, it kind of just spirals out from there. Pretty much any relationship that we have to other people or to our own bodies and minds, it has this cloud hanging over it of don't say no, don't, say you don't feel like doing something, say yes, take it on. And if not, why not? What's wrong with you? That kind of thing.
Right. Like I can really see that there's this, it's an acculturation. And a lot of it has to do with some of like our unexamined assumptions around who we need to be, what we have to say yes to, what we can say no to or can't say no to, and sort of just going along with whatever we see as this. I mean, the way in which you present it is like it's a cultural norm that has been infused in so many different ways that we're pretty much unaware that this has been a norm. This is a norm that's been, communicated to us. And you do talk a little bit about, or a lot in your book around ways in which we can become aware of the laziness lie. Um, just in our own self-examination process and some of the things that we can do, which I really appreciate that because when there is this enculturation around a specific idea or way of being, sometimes if we're given this information and we go, well, I don't now, what do I do with this, right? What do I, how do I work with this? And so there's sort of this grounding in like in narrative and personal story. And I'm curious, and maybe we'll get over to some of that a little bit later in the interview, but I'm really curious about, when you started to examine this idea of laziness and what it meant, in your life and in the lives of people that you were seeing around you. Um, what was that like for you to really start going into this topic and to uncover some of the things that you've already talked about in just these few minutes of the beginning of our time together?
Yeah, that's a question that I don't think I've been asked before about this. It's heavy. The the way that this book came into being was that I initially wrote an essay called Laziness Does Not Exist that was really just focused on students and how unfair it seemed to me that a lot of professors that I had bumped into at various places where I taught over the years would just write off their students as lazy or kind of just dismiss students, assuming that they were faking if they said that a grandparent died or they were sick, this just base assumption that students were not taking class seriously and weren't trying hard enough. And it was so counter to my own experience from when I was a student and all of the stories I was hearing from these students, because a lot of them would open up to me about just the incredible number of things that they were juggling in their life and coping with. So I wrote an essay about that, and the reaction that I got from that essay and the number of personal stories that people sent to me is what kind of made me start to realize just how pervasive this problem is, or at least that that it was something that I wanted to speak to even further. So it's been kind of this, that essay I wrote in 2018. And so I've been thinking about this stuff for a few years now. And pretty much that whole time, it's just hearing all these stories from people who they've internalized so much guilt from parents who told them that they were inadequate because they had, executive functioning challenges because they're depressed or they have ADHD or trauma or whatever else. People who are in an industry where, and this is most industries, frankly, they're set up in a way that's just not sustainable. They have expectations that are just not even if we were going by the most cold-blooded productivity research, you wouldn't design workdays this way. And yet this is how most workdays are designed. And people
Right.
and people are blaming themselves when they can't sustain, you know, an 80-hour workday,
Mm-hmm.
and have to drop out of her career. So it's heavy. It was especially heavy to hear a lot of people's stories of burnout.
Yeah.
And also in writing this book, I feel really heavily the tension between, I want to give people practical advice for how they can take better stock of this stuff in their own lives. And I'm also acutely aware that this is a white supremacy problem, this is a
Mm-hmm.
capitalism problem, this is an imperialism problem, and an individual person can't solve it. And we've had a lot of self-help books in the world that are about, you know, here's set some good work-life boundaries,
Right.
and it's not enough. So it's a heavy thing to carry and to think about how to navigate responsibly.
Well, I really imagine too, as a social psychologist too, it's like, I mean, you really look at the individual in relationship. And so I can see how, like, even from the perspective, I mean, I imagine the perspective that you took in doing your research and in writing this, that, I mean, you thought about the various different webs and circles and intersections that, people are living within, and how this laziness lie affects them and their lives. And I'm curious if you want to speak more to that around, how privilege does play into the laziness lie, and what people can actually do about it as a result.
Yeah, it's so striking, and I don't think it comes as a surprise to pretty much anyone who probably who's here or watching. If they're here for this conversation, they're probably not surprised to hear it. But the people that I spoke to in the book that were able to set boundaries or really walk away from a toxic work environment were almost always people who had an economic cushion or access to family who could they could live with to weather the storm, some amount of privilege to make it possible for them to say no,
Mhm.
in a economic system and a culture where just, giving your life to your work is something that's really normalized and often required just to get by. So yeah, that's something where I try to encourage people who are reading the book, knowing that this book is listed as self-help and it's going to reach a pretty wide audience, including people who maybe aren't economically as far left as I am on these things, to kind of think about, okay, clearly these are really systemic problems. And I've been taught not only to feel laziness in myself, but to look at other people who are marginalized as lazy. So can I rethink the person on the corner who's asking for money? Can I rethink how I feel about social welfare programs? Or, maybe for a lot of people, think for the first time about disability benefits and how hard those are to
Mhm.
navigate, or what life's actually like when you're homeless. Um, and and I go back and forth on how successful, or like whether I took it far enough in the book, or
Right.
like how to thread that needle of getting people on board who maybe aren't fully, let's say, in favor of universal basic income or some solution like that
Mhm.
yet, and slowly kind of moving the tide so that people realize, okay, yes, I'm a lawyer and I'm working 80-hour weeks and I feel horrible about my body and I feel like I never have enough time for my kids, but also, I might eventually be able to retire. I might be able to eventually set some limits. And who are the other people that don't have that power? And how can I take steps and support policies that'll help
Mhm.
all of us? So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I really appreciate that perspective, because I think it's really important for us as individuals, especially, if we're sitting in a place of privilege, to be able to recognize the steps that we can take for ourselves, as well as the things that we can do to support those who maybe aren't in the same position as we are, and I mean, I like that you bookend your book with that story, or around, the mom. I mean, it's a really classic example of, like, the mom who, tells their kid not to give money to the homeless person because, all the various different reasons that you list and what they're going to do with the money. But the thing is that we don't really know their individual situation. And so some of what I'm also hearing you kind of say is, it's like, and even in your example around your students, is that we have these assumptions based on people's actions and where they might sit, but there's something really important about actually getting to know what it is, what's going on with them. And you speak to this, and I'm wondering if you can talk about this a little bit more around how this, how laziness can actually be an indicator of something else.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe I'll go with one example from the book of this student who tweeted at me after I'd written the essay, Laziness Does Not Exist. And he said, listen, I'm lazy. I'm actually lazy, which this is the thing that happens. People very, very rarely come to me and say, oh, what about my brother-in-law? He's so lazy. Or like, oh, what about my coworker? They're so lazy. It's almost always, no, listen, I'm lazy. And this college student, he kind of said, when I'm depressed, I don't get anything done. I just lay in my bed and I'm completely like useless and I don't get anything done. And also when I was in high school, me and my friends, we would make kind of a show of procrastinating on papers. And I think some people, it really was that they just wanted to stick it to the school, that they would, do their homework on the bus. Like, how could you not call that laziness?
Mm-hmm.
So for the first thing that he brought up, it was kind of heartbreaking that he knew he had depression and
Mm-hmm.
he still didn't think that that was enough of a context to absolve him of being lazy. So, in the book, I kind of break down just let's really talk about physiologically and psychologically what happens when you're depressed. Your sleep is less deep and less restful. You do need more hours of sleep because your sleep quality is poorer.
Mm-hmm.
Your ability to think is slowed down and impaired. Your ability to sequence tasks is impaired. You are marshaling a lot of cognitive resources towards staying alive. And it's this incredibly difficult battle. And I hope most of us wouldn't call someone who's on chemotherapy fighting cancer lazy. I think that still happens. And certainly a lot of people with physical disabilities get called lazy.
Right.
But the level that people with invisible illnesses and mental illnesses have it is just so far behind that even someone who's acutely suffering from it wasn't giving himself credit for how hard he was fighting to stay alive.
Mm-hmm.
And then to go with the more easy to demonize example of some teens who were kind of just screwing off in class, it just made me think about when I was a teenager and how little control I had in the world and how you are developing personhood and you have very little agency, very little control over how you spend your time, and you're being condescended to in ways that feel like, I'm an adult person, like you feel like you are, and you're still being hampered in.
Yeah.
So stealing free time where you can get it and screwing off on rules that you don't agree with, that you are not free to break out of because you're stuck going to school, that to me seems very logical, and it's not a moral failure. It's someone for the first time in their life getting to set their own priorities. And we might not agree with those priorities. If we're that kid's parent, we might say, please do your homework. Like, this will pay off. This will pay off in the long run, I promise. But, a person setting goals and putting their energy towards the things that matter to them and withdrawing energy from the things that don't matter to them, that's not laziness. That's a person
Right.
behaving very rationally. Again, we might disagree with it, but it's not laziness.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's really about kind of how others are then looking at those particular behaviors or ways of reacting or responding to certain requests or demands from others. Because if somebody doesn't agree with it, and they say no, if the norm is that, well, if you say no to this, then it means you don't care, you're lazy, or whatever it is, then I mean, I don't, I wonder if you could speak to that, like, what someone who doesn't subscribe to this, or let's say they read your book and they say, yeah, I actually really agree that this laziness idea is a lie and I don't want to adhere to it anymore, but yet they're still in circles where if they start to change their behaviors, they might be looked upon not in the same light. And so I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions around what someone might do in that particular scenario. You know, how does somebody start to, I guess let me rephrase that, like how does somebody start to change their internal relationship to the laziness lie? And then when that happens, you know, how do they then um, shift their relationship to their external relationships in regard to the laziness lie?
Yeah. So, as I kind of alluded to, I think it does come down to taking stock of your values and
Mm-hmm.
then taking stock of how does my day or the life that I've built and in many ways been forced to build out of necessity line up or fail to line up with those values. So there's a variety of different kind of questions and activities sprinkled throughout to kind of help think about that. But fundamentally, it's looking at, okay, if I really wanted to focus my life on upholding, you know, 3 values, what would those things be? Would it be family? Would it be equality, creativity, making money? What are the things that truly drive me and make me feel alive? And then how am I actually spending my day? And what are the goals that I set out to meet that I don't meet? And how do I feel about those? What are the things that I don't get done that I can kind of just look at the fact that I routinely don't do them and just say, I'm going to take this as data. Maybe this thing doesn't actually matter to me. I've
Mm-hmm.
just been told that it should matter to me. And so I can let it go. So that might be something like exercising every day. You know, you put it on your calendar, you set this intention and you don't get to it because you're exhausted or you want to socialize or play a video game or whatever it is. And maybe if you don't actually see exercising every day as being important for your values, maybe you can just let that go and just say, okay, this is now my video game hour every day.
Right.
Um, and conversely, if there's something that you're really setting out to do that you never find time for, and it really makes you notice this misstep and this gap between who you want to be and what your life is actually like, let's say spending time with your kids, instead of yelling at yourself for lacking willpower to cram all these things into this musket that is clearly too tight, asking yourself, what am I going to get rid of? Who am I going to disappoint? And that brings me to the next piece and the second part of your question, which is how do you socially begin to do these things?
Mm-hmm.
And so I do talk about, you know, pick someone every week that you're going to disappoint. That was a useful way of thinking about it and doing it for me because I was so afraid of people being unhappy with me and disappointed
Yeah.
in me and using other people's emotions too much as a guideline for how I'm supposed to conduct myself
Mm-hmm.
instead of listening to my own values. So for me, it was very useful to set a goal of, okay, at least once a week, someone's going to ask me for something and I'm going to let them down. And it will be good practice for me from just even an emotional regulation perspective to
Mm-hmm.
recognize this person asked for something. My gut says I should say yes. I'm going to say no. And I'm going to sit with that distress and the world's not going to end. And now I'm not going to resent this person later, which is what I
Yeah.
would have done otherwise, or I would have like lied to explain why I couldn't do the thing or whatever. So I think that's really important. I think looking at really deeply ingrained societal rules and recognizing, of course, everyone around you is influenced by this stuff. So yes,
Mm-hmm.
if you start dressing differently, people are going to sometimes go, oh, that doesn't look professional, or like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, you look so tired, you know, like you're going to get these little nudges. And every person kind of has to gauge for themselves what they can get away with saying no to, what they can get away with letting drop. And of course, this goes back to the privilege issue,
Mm-hmm. Right.
where it's very easy for me as a professor to say, well, I'm not going to dress up at work. It doesn't matter. It's actually better if we don't have that pretense, or, you know, it's very
Mm-hmm.
easy for me to say that, and not everyone can do that. But within the lines that you are in, trusting your own perception of the world that you're in, what can you release that you're just going through the motions because you're afraid of disappointing people?
Mm-hmm.
That you can just give yourself permission to go ahead and disappoint them or not meet that standard anymore.
Yeah. I like that, and I totally resonate with your example of, attuning to other people's emotions and feeling their disappointment or whatever when you say no. So I can really understand how difficult that can be, and I like that idea of doing it in a way that's slow, where it's kind of like a titration, a way of sort of easing into a different way of being rather than thinking that you have to just, you know, once you agree, if someone were to read your book and then go, yeah, I completely agree with this, I'm going to change my whole life right now, that's maybe not the best way to go about it, that it's something that takes time and it takes work to really kind of reauthor your own understanding of your relationship to the laziness lie, and how you've sort of constructed your life um, according to productivity and doing more and feeling like you have to just continue to produce.
Right. This is another thing that you like don't be a perfectionist about, right? Like it would be
Right.
like I still, and I still do it too. I applied the logic of like, oh, I'm going to be the best at fighting the laziness lie, which what, this is a long process, and it's not your fault that you've internalized this stuff. It's not your fault that these expectations have been placed upon you. And one of the big failures of a lot of pop psychology and self-help and that writing is presenting individual solutions where you just need to be more assertive and as an
Hmm.
individual overcome these structural problems. And that's just not how that stuff works. I do want to give people kind of a life raft and some tools for, okay, you're in a really unfair, turbulent situation. Here are some things you can hold on to and use to make it more tenable for you. But it's not like, okay, today's the day I fundamentally change who I am in every way and have amazing willpower and stop everyone, and I'm going to feel bad and like I'm
Right.
betraying myself if I still succumb to this stuff, because we all do.
Right. Well, and I mean, I think what you're also saying too is it's like we can't apply the same patterns that produced the laziness lie to unravel them. Right. It's
Mhm.
really about changing relationships to and changing patterns to and really looking at internal values. I mean, I know from like a developmental perspective, when we're in like our 20s to late 20s, early 30s, we really go through this process of developing our own internal compass to, values and moral systems and things like that. But if we've adopted this moral system of productivity is related to your worth, that it takes time to repattern and to rework not just the internal relationship to those morals and values, but a repatterning of our behaviors and the ways in which we relate to the world. And yeah, I mean, I can really see though how it would be really easy in one regard to just apply the same sort of ideas around productivity to the laziness lie. Like, oh, I'm gonna undo the laziness lie, and
Yeah, yeah, and I see it a lot in like activist spaces too, and a lot of people have written about this. Adrienne Marie Brown is probably the like best known who wrote Pleasure Activism person talking
Mhm.
about this. But this idea that like a practice of like trying to liberate people that's still rooted in perfectionism, get everything done, take everything on as an individual, policing individuals for are you doing enough for the cause? Like that's still the
Right.
same mindset of the laziness lie, capitalism, white supremacy, all of those things that are just saying individuals need to be good and virtuous instead of
Mhm.
saying, how do we build a society that takes care of everyone?
Right.
And we throw the are they a good, virtuous, hardworking person question completely off the table.
Right, right. It's really a completely different frame and construction around how we value ourselves and how we value each other within our society. Um, I'm really curious if you could talk a little bit more about, if we were to shift our perspectives, away from, this idea of productivity being our worth, and really kind of take on your suggestions around the laziness lie, how we might practice self-care and wellness and what that might really look like for someone.
Yeah, I think the place to start in answering that question is looking at how we think about and talk about self-care right now and how distorted it is. I guess in some ways we're in a better place than we were. I can't remember when I first heard the term self-care, but I was into my 20s, you know, so it was something I was not familiar with up until that point. And so it's good that it's become a cultural conversation
Mm-hmm.
more. It certainly had been researched for a few decades before I heard of it as a person, but it was mostly in the context of um, social workers, nurses, caregivers, and how do you keep people in these really emotionally turbulent professions like
Right.
stable. So it's good that self-care has become a big conversation in the public landscape, but it's become very much a commodity, a thing that
Mm-hmm.
you schedule, a thing that you put on your to-do list, usually a thing that you buy, whether it's a bath bomb or a pedicure or something like
Right.
that. And it can also be something that you're supposed to kind of implicitly perform. So especially a few years ago, Instagram was very bad in this regard. Lots of like bubble bath photos and photos of here's this art that I made, here's this beautiful craft, here's, you know, this beautiful makeup look I did, and it's self-care, but it's also something that I'm going to measure how well I'm doing based on how people
Right.
receive it. Not that it's wrong to want to broadcast things to the world. I'm on social media constantly, so I get that it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
So at this point, the term has become such a commodity that I don't know how do we rework thinking of it as just this isn't a thing that you earn. It isn't a thing that you set aside a little amount of time for. It's having a completely different outlook to your body and listening to your body and not trying to argue with every feeling that you have. Um, in this regard, I'm kind of really inspired by the eating disorder recovery community, where
Mm-hmm.
when someone's developing a sense of intuitive eating, you've been ignoring your body's hunger cues for an incredibly long time. So just learning to listen to your hunger and taking that hunger wherever it wants to go without judgment, without saying, oh, I haven't worked out enough today to be hungry,
Mm-hmm.
or to want chocolate, just letting it go. I think that approach is really important. It's so far from the way most of us organize our days because of our jobs.
Right.
So I think it would really mean totally reorienting what the workplace looks like. We're in a better moment for that than ever before because of work from home options, but
Mm-hmm.
we're also in some ways in a worse place than ever before because it's like you never leave work, so you never listen to your to your hunger and boredness. Um, but I think that's what ultimately the goal is of kind of rethinking self-care in terms of what am I going to say no to? What don't I feel like doing? What are ways that I'm trying to meet some societal standard that I don't actually care about?
Mm-hmm.
And can I really listen when I feel annoyed, irritated, tired, whatever it is, and honor that instead of beating myself up over it?
Yeah, I like that. I mean, and I mean, I think what your example really highlights too is that, the way in which self-care and wellness has kind of been commodified, it's really about the presentation of it. And, what you're pointing to is really, it's less about, I mean, it's less about the presentation. Yeah, it might show that you're taking care of yourself, but it's really about the inner landscape and the inner relationship to how you're caring for yourself, how you're listening to your needs. And again, I think that the thread that I continue to keep hearing is it's about reorienting yourself around your own internal values, needs, and wants, and distancing yourself from, as much as you can, from what the expectations are, the societal expectations are around productivity and, how you're gaining or losing worth as a result of that. And I understand, um, you know, from some of the things that you've written and talked about, I mean, your understanding of how this is tied to, industrialization and slavery. I mean, it's so systemic that there are multiple different intersections and layers that each of us are sitting within that allows us different levels of responsibility as well as availability to making these various changes within our lives. Mm. So,
Absolutely. And I think what breaking out of it looks like is going to vary for each person, and based on that baggage that they're living with under this, right? So, there's Tricia Hershey of the NAP ministry, who is all about talking about rest as liberation for especially Black women, though, like, she produces writing and content that's under the like understanding of like the legacy of slavery has tainted everyone's relationship to their bodies. It's this traumatic event, and everyone needs rest very fundamentally, and that's where it kind of needs to begin in her kind of perspective. I also am really inspired by there's an autistic writer and sex educator, Stevie Lang, who's been talking, I think it was like over the summer that they kind of started doing writing about the fact that for a lot of autistic people, which I also am autistic, self-care doesn't necessarily look like rest. For a lot of us, it looks like engaging with our special interests, the topics and activities that we're really obsessive about. Like when you're like really, and this is true of people with ADHD too, sometimes, if you have a topic that you're right now really obsessive about, it actually can be an act of self-care to go, all right, I'm gonna make a Wikipedia table about all of my favorite Pokemon because the table on the current Wikipedia is trash, and I'm going to stay up. I'm going to stay up all night making this awesome table, and I'm doing something that like society would still see as frivolous. It's work, but it's about something silly and not impressive. Right. And so that can be self-care too. So that's a thing that that I also want to highlight, that like even the idea of what self-care is and what it looks like is being imposed on you from the outside. And sometimes you have to think, okay, do I actually want a bubble bath, or do I want to play Call of Duty all night long, or like Dungeons and Dragons?
Right.
It might be both, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's really about, I mean, I think that even from like, it makes me remember too, that even from like a hormonal perspective, that what we need from the outside I mean, some people need rest. Some people like, like I know for me, when I'm overwhelmed and I've had enough, like I need to sleep. I just need to be like, that's how I get my rest. But like, my husband, when he's overwhelmed and he's at his top, like he needs to go for a run. And like, from like the perspective of self-care, like we're doing the same thing, but in two totally different ways. And, I think his way would be considered more productive, if you will, right? The exercising and all of that, where, for me, like as I'm sleeping, I'm actually processing. I'm somebody who processes a lot, and I read a lot. I take in a lot of information. And so, in addition to like writing in various different ways, I also process when I sleep. And so I think that that's also something, to I mean, each of us process information in different ways. We need different outlets in order to just give ourselves that break. Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I appreciate that perspective. Yeah, one of the things too, and I wonder if you run up against this, just in academia, that there's this idea, and this is maybe also in activism as well, that there's this idea that we have to kind of be experts in everything, have to kind of, just kind of know everything. And I'm just wondering, like how do you see, when we're sort of reading and constantly, in that place of like taking in a lot of information and data points and things like that, how information can even overload us, and what that might, how you can kind of contextualize that within the laziness lie as well.
Yeah, I think that's an under-recognized facet of the laziness lie for a lot of people. The pressure to constantly be learning, to constantly be very well read on every issue, to have an opinion on every issue that's already crystallized, to constantly be following the news, and this idea that if you're not doing all of those things, you're a bad person and socially irresponsible, and intellectually lazy and all those things. In academia, it definitely takes this form where people are so unwilling to admit when they don't know something. That's, I feel like, the flavor that I see it take the most in academia, even starting out really early in their careers. I just remember even when I was getting trained in just teaching, like how to be a professor, like people were so afraid to admit to their students, oh, I don't know the answer to that question. And when you're afraid to admit that you don't know the answer to a question, you don't get to model for your students the skills of, here's how I go about finding information and digesting it when I don't know the answer. And as a scientist, it's really counter to the whole idea of what science is supposed to be, which is tentative, open to revision, serving the public interest. So for us to act like we know everything, or that knowledge is kind of set in stone, is just really against the whole philosophy, supposedly, of what we're supposed to be doing.
Right.
And academia has so many workplace and worker rights issues. Just the fact that we use graduate students for very, very cheap labor and justify it by saying, we're teaching you, we're giving you an education. And it's true, I did learn a lot of things in graduate school, but I had no protections as a worker. I supposedly was supposed to work 20 hours per week, but there was no one keeping track of that. And if I was asked to do more than 20 hours a week, there's nothing I could do to say no, right? So that's a very pervasive cultural problem there. And then kind of leaving academia and talking bigger picture, though this is an academic problem as well. We have more information now than any other time in human history.
Right.
And that includes a lot of junk data, because the amount of information on the internet that is created is exponential. So it just keeps growing and growing at an accelerating rate. And so we take in more than people did. We take more in a day than people did in a week in the 80s. It's just, and that's very stressful. Like you said, you need time and sleep to process information. The process of really breaking down a new, let's say, news article and thinking about, okay, how do I reconcile this fact with the things that I already know and believe? And what comes next if this is something that's happening, in the economy or in the healthcare system? What do we do next about this? How do I feel about this? That stuff all takes time and slowness. And if you're just constantly being bombarded or bombarding yourself with information, you don't get to go deeper. And your memory of what you've consumed is poorer. Your ability to scrutinize real, reputable news from conspiracy theories is degraded. It's easier for you to fall for scams. And you're also just physiologically anxious. I think we've all had the experience in this past year of being on your phone too late into the night and then not being able to sleep.
Yeah, and all the Zoom, even though the Zoom has offered such a beautiful platform for being able to do things like this and to really, communicate in real time across the world, it also, I mean, Zoom fatigue wasn't a thing, until this last year,
Right. Yeah. Just the number of social demands being made of us can just because you're just always at home and you can just always open up a new Zoom window. It's like unending, and so stressful. So yeah, in the book, I try to really stress to people that you're not actually a irresponsible person for saying, I need to slow way down on this. That's actually the mark of being a more responsible citizen. Like if you're worried about not being active enough or engaged enough on an issue, it's a news media industry problem that we have constant information, and a social media problem that we have constant information. It's not because we actually have like some obligation as citizens to constantly be taking information in. And what we know from decades of research at this point that dates back to when the 24-hour news cycle and 24-hour news channels really started is that if people consume too much negative news, they actually become more passive and more fearful and less politically engaged. So setting limits is actually the empowering and I think like ethically superior thing, because if you care about being involved in issues that matter in the world, you can't be shell-shocked all the time.
Right. Yeah, you need to be able to critically think about your situations and the ways in which you're engaging in the world and what actions are going to perhaps have the most impact, I'm curious, since you're kind of you're sort of going that way a little bit, just around how, and I guess it can go both ways, this question, but, how can we be good activists in the world, without kind of succumbing to this laziness line? I think you spoke to that a little bit in that last answer, but maybe you could speak to this a little bit more specifically.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say, and this is true of the laziness lie and battling it in general, make sure that you're giving yourself enough credit for all of the things that you're doing. So a lot of things that we don't consider capital A activism are still materially helping people in your community, being a support person for people in your life who are vulnerable in whatever way, educating people in your life by having just casual conversations with them that are not contentious, but are actually like, okay, let's talk about how we both, feel about white supremacy and the weird, uncomfortable feelings that arises in us.
Mm-hmm.
And like, let's do it from a position of let's both actually talk about it and reflect rather than I'm going to change your mind and change your actions after one conversation, because that's just
Right.
not how
That's not
human
how it
change
works.
works.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's just not a fair standard to put on anyone.
Right.
And when people feel that, they shut down anyway. Um, so giving yourself credit for every small thing that you do that is making the world a better place. One example of this that I often give is my sister, who um, was not a super politically engaged person. She's 27, I think. Yeah, she's about to be 28, and had only voted for the first time in this last election. But she's also an athletic trainer at a school in a rural area that is, because of their athletic program, more racially diverse than the area would normally be in Ohio. And she is someone who she hears all this locker room conversation and she's constantly shutting down racism. She's constantly shutting down homophobia. Her office is a safe space that girls at the school go to ask questions about things that they can't ask most of
Mm.
their teachers about, like serious, relationship issues and like sexual health questions. She's doing activism in my book.
Yeah.
She is making life a better place for Black kids, queer kids, women, all these people in this rural, very religious area. And that is way more impactful a lot of the times than a lot of the things that I do that are more showy, like whatever, action it is that I, go
Mm-hmm.
to or help organize or whatever it is. Um, so looking for those small opportunities and really valuing those, I think is really important. And I think it also helps us build a more sustainable activism, because if you're fighting against a huge problem and you never feel like you're making a dent in it, psychologically, that is very demotivating.
Right.
People just can't stick it with something like that for the most part. So
Mm-hmm.
instead of thinking about how am I going to end climate change, first take some space to mourn the fact that you're not going to like end it. There are going to be losses and damage that we're going to have to deal with. And it's okay to like really feel that fear and sadness, and then think about, okay, what can I do in my community to help people who are going to be impacted by this? What can I do to support Indigenous people in my area who are growing plants in traditional ways?
Mm-hmm.
Small things where I can see, hey, here's this Native community garden, and I helped make this possible, or I helped support it, or fund it, or whatever it is. Because those things are important, and we're just small humans. We can't save the world individually, but we can do these
Right.
small things that are rewarding and sustainable, that align with our values.
That's a really important point. I think, just considering everything that we've been talking about and, the what you present in your book around, us feeling like we have to be doing and present, doing these huge things in order for us to have value, that I mean, what I heard you say is that the importance of valuing all of the little things that we do and to not overlook those things as something that's just like, oh yeah, I just did that, or that's just a small thing, but to really recognize that those small things could actually turn into something, or actually they don't even have to turn into something more. They are enough,
Right.
right? It's like all of that is enough, which I think is I don't think you can say that too many times for people.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's a lot of guilting messages that people encounter, and it comes from a place of trauma, right? People
Right.
are really traumatized by so many injustices and systemic problems in our society. So they go, well, what are you doing about this? I'm doing all this work. Is everybody else doing enough? And it resentment and guilting, I've noticed, almost always comes from a place of someone who is doing too much and carrying too much and not having that seen. So the solution to that is not to cave necessarily to that pressure and to hold everyone to this standard of, okay, activism is my new part-time job and I have to spend XYZ hours per day or week doing all these things. It's to kind of really say, okay, none of us individually can undo this. We are all really suffering. And that suffering can take a lot of different forms. And obviously,
Yeah.
some people are more structurally oppressed than others, certainly. And being mindful of that is important, but really looking at what can I do to make my neighbor's life better? Who, in my neighborhood can I check up on? Or what small organizations can I help build political power? Or who can I just have a conversation with to like learn more about what their life is actually like and what they actually want? Because none of the groups that we're trying to advocate for, or when we're advocating for ourselves, we're not monoliths. So a lot of times advocating for, I don't know, indigenous people in your neighborhood might look very different from how it looks, what it looks like from me here in Chicago might look very different from California, for
Right.
example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I'm curious, just as I know we're nearing the end of our hour, and so I want to kind of see if you can speak a little bit more to, and I know you've talked about this in so many different ways, but maybe some of the more, kind of maybe poignant parts that you want to bring up here at the end around, what we can do or what people can do to really fight back against this lie of laziness. Like what would you say are some of the, like if someone is saying, okay, I want to start now. I want to start taking some steps to change my relationship to the laziness lie. What would you say would be some good first steps for someone to
Yeah.
take?
Yeah. So one thing I think, and this connects to what we were just talking about, I think, um, compassion and practicing it for others
Mhm.
sometimes makes it way easier for us to be gentle with ourselves. And also, it obviously has these massive societal ripple effects of making other people's lives easier, which is really important.
Mhm.
So, learning and making a practice of slowing down when you feel just dismay at someone's actions and you immediately want to write them off as it's because they're this kind of person, to just kind of, okay, all right, I had that little internal temper tantrum, and that's totally fine and natural to initially respond to someone who's disappointed me or somebody who's done something that's dismaying, to go, oh, they're a horrible person. Okay, I did that. What could be the broader context that is
Mm.
explaining this? Why is
Mhm.
this person, if they're sharing lots of misinformation online, what fears do they have that have manipulated them into thinking, they need to protect their children from this imaginary cult or whatever it is? Like, what are they going through? Like, and how lonely might they be that they're getting, kind of indoctrinated with that information, as an example? Or what happens to me in my work a lot is if I hear a coworker complaining about a student kind of in a non-judgmental way, reflecting, oh, it sounds like they're really going through a lot, or like, oh,
Yeah.
that must be really stressful for them, that if they're 5 weeks behind on assignments. It's good they emailed you. They probably were really scared to email you. Not telling somebody else that they're a bad person for calling that student lazy.
Right, right.
Just kind of slowly modeling the skills, because nobody's a bad person for having internalized this stuff. It's very natural and we all have it. So modeling that compassion and curiosity and humility, starting to apply it a little bit more to yourself. I'm a big fan of like looking at your pet and noticing that like your pet has worth to you no matter what they're doing.
Yes.
My pet chinchilla has not done a productive thing in his life and he's perfect. Nature, I think, is really good at helping us kind of remember that stuff. And yeah, and then thinking about what are the moments in my life where I felt the most alive and aligned with my values, and how can I make a life that has more of that? So some of those are small steps. Some of those are kind of more bigger existential things that we'll always have to deal with, but you know, it's a process.
Yeah. Well, and I love that you talk about compassion and curiosity, because those are two components that I often talk about with students around, because I see students feel really judgmental about themselves and about their processes and the way in which their work, whether or not they're doing something that's related to their research, or they're doing something that's, kind of more of a practice, right? Like a practice that they're learning, some sort of like somatic practice, or transpersonal practice, or whatever. That it's so easy for the judgments and the critical thoughts to come in, and there really is something that shifts, um, qualitatively, when you shift into a place of curiosity, and instead of just creating a judgment that this is the way things are, but to get curious about what's happening, what that experience is, whether it's for yourself or for somebody else. It opens up such a broader range of possibilities, and it also gives space. It gives space to be less reactive, and more to be in that place of like, how do I want to respond to this, or what is a way that would be appropriate to respond to this, and of course, depending on your position in relationship to another person, that response might look different. But I really appreciate um, that you brought those two components in.
Yeah, and as educators, we have to do a lot to kind of drop those walls that keep students from telling us those things, like
Hmm.
curiosity combined with kind of showing that we're actually a safe person, that it's real curiosity. It's not, why can't you do this? It's like, how can we do things differently? What are the things that I'm asking of you that are not making sense or that are not possible?
Hmm.
And I think at different places where I've taught, they've had different cultures, and some of them have had more kind of toxic workaholic shaming kind of cultures than others.
Yeah.
And in those places, I had to really, to an appropriate amount, be vulnerable with my own students, or kind of acknowledge, here are things that I struggle with, or, if we're talking about mental health stigma, I'm going to tell you that, like, here we are in this psychology class talking about mental health stigma, and I'm going to tell you that there are some people that believe that people with mental illnesses or disabilities shouldn't be psychologists, and it's a really damaging view, and
Hmm.
I'm a case of why that's not true, and why it's very
Hmm.
important for there to be people who are neurodiverse in this career.
Hmm. Absolutely.
And once you say something like that, then students will start kind of like opening up to you and saying, hey, I was actually skipping this. Like, these are things that happened to me. Like, hey, I've actually been skipping your class because I'm in an eating disorder like day treatment program, and I'm just so exhausted just processing all of this stuff, and like
Hmm.
rethinking my whole approach to food, that sometimes I just can't be around people, especially after lunchtime. And it's like, oh, okay, now that I like, thank you for trusting me with that information. I know not every professor would handle it right. And
Hmm.
let's talk about, what trigger warnings do you need for course material? Like, what can we do when you do need to skip class? Like, all of these things. But most students have been, and most people have been burned so many times that it takes a while to extend that, like, you can tell me your context
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. And then to really feel that they can be heard in
Yeah.
that. Yeah. This is more of a personal question, and I'm just curious about, since you've gone down this path of research and writing this book. I'm curious about what is, maybe one or a couple of the more significant things that have changed for you, in relationship to laziness.
Oh gosh, I always feel like such a hypocrite talking about this stuff because it's still so hard. So I feel like I've had a few key moments in my life where I've gone, okay, this is not sustainable. I need to really change course. Like, deciding after finishing grad school, okay, I'm not going to apply to tenure track jobs. I'm not going to be on that grind. I can't do it. I'm going to do consulting. I'm going to teach classes here and there, and I'm going to do my writing. Like, that was a big moment for me. And I've had these other moments along the way, like after I started working on this book, of like, okay, I need to stop saying yes to all these committee invitations that I get, because writing is the thing that's important. But it's like whack-a-mole. I don't know. I have still so many rules in my head about who I'm supposed to be and what I'm supposed to be doing and things I feel bad about, that I just have to go at them and say like, okay, who is that, me, or is that like is that society that's telling me this? What fears and like stigmas are motivating this? So I think it's kind of one of those things. It's a little bit of a wormhole, or like telescoping maybe is what I'm trying to say, where
Yeah.
the farther you get, the more you realize you have to go, and so it kind of, you can feel kind of stuck in doing it. But I try not to be a perfectionist about being the best. And I'm learning the laziness lie, and try to just know that these things will keep popping up, and see it as like, here's a whole new way that I can get free each time, on a good day.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
how that is.
I love that, because I think sometimes when when you've written a book, and, this is an area of research that you've gone deep into, sometimes people can think like, she's got it all figured out, or they've got it all figured out, and they do this perfectly all the time. And so, it's really good, I think, for a lot of people to hear that even though you have the landscape, it's still something that you have to work on every single day.
Yeah, that's a thing that I hate about most self-help books. It's like the voice is so like, of the writer is so detached and like
Yeah,
ascended. And maybe it's because I'm a researcher rather than a practitioner,
right.
that I feel more comfortable being like, I'm a mess. It's fine. Let's
Yeah,
just all work on this together.
yeah, yeah. Oh, well, I've really appreciated this time being in conversation with you, Devon. And I know that there are some really great questions that are coming from the audience. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jason, and he'll take you into the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Kendra.
Thanks,
This is
Devon. Take
great.
care.
All right, Devin, are you ready for some audience questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, the first question is from Tanya. I am a yoga and mindfulness teacher within a high performing NYC charter school network. How can I bring these principles into a school that valorizes productivity and academic achievement at the expense of mental and emotional health?
Whew. Okay, first of all, like, uh, give yourself some credit for just having to deal with that, like that tension, and having to shoulder all of that every day. That's really hard. I think, gosh, you're in a unique position where if you're doing yoga, they said that they're a yoga practitioner. Did I hear that correct?
Yes, a yoga and mindfulness teacher within
And
a high
mindfulness
performing
teacher.
NYC charter school.
Okay, cool. So you are like on the front lines of like seeing the weird tension between people realize that they're stressed out, and they realize that they don't have like the somatic and emotional skills that they need, but they're not ready yet to kind of recognize, oh, this is a bigger issue, right? Like they can't really confront yet. I think a lot of people, especially in that kind of high performing kind of elite environment, that like, oh, this is like a capitalism problem, a white supremacy problem, it's a political thing, even though we might not want to think about it as political. So you are in a really unique and awesome position where you can kind of like slowly move people into thinking about these things, both by like kind of modeling for them the skills that you already, by virtue of your line of work, are an expert in, um, giving them both the tools to listen to their own bodies better and set their own kind of limits. You can kind of leave kind of little pointed, respectful questions about like when a person's kind of saying, oh, I have to do this, this, and this, like, you know, you don't want to directly be as confrontational as like, do you really have to do that? But kind of get people into the mindset of like, you know, you can give yourself permission not to do these things if you don't actually like them, or they don't really align with who you are, and kind of slowly encourage people to think about, okay, as I'm practicing listening to my own body and finding more time for rest for myself, who are the people in my life that I can also try to make space so that they can have a more kind of restful and mindful and restorative kind of existence. I think you're in a really tricky position because you are, I'm sure, are living the cognitive dissonance of like the wellness industry, like being a very like capitalist neoliberal thing. But I think that also means you're in a really unique spot where just even a few little observations and giving people tools that are just a little bit more, a little bit more systemic than they're used to. Whether that's, like Adrienne Marie Brown's like pleasure activism kind of writing, that's like still very approachable to people who are like, I'm going to meditate and then I'm going to go back to the office kind of outlook. Or just kind of, again, making little observations that slowly move people forward on that. But also, I will keep you in my prayers and crystals, because that's also a really hard and exhausting dissonance to navigate.
All right, wonderful. We'll have another question. Is there a certain degree of accountability about productivity that is necessary? Isn't it still important to hold yourself to a certain standard of productivity? And how can you find a balance between rejecting laziness, but also achieving tasks that you want to achieve?
I don't know that accountability is necessarily necessary. Like if we look at, for example, the unschooling movement, this idea that you can let children to a much greater extent than we do in the conventional education system, direct their own learning and give them space to pursue the things that they are passionate about. In that kind of environment, I think most parents who are unschooling their kids, they still have certain ideas of, here are skills that are important for me to impart and opportunities that I'm going to make available for my kid, things like basic reading skills, things like that. But generally, I'm fostering a sense of agency and letting a person's intrinsic motivation drive them. We have it very ingrained in us by the laziness lie that we can't believe and trust our feelings or other people's feelings, and that we have to have all of these systems in place to very bureaucratically make sure people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so that leads to, standardized testing, even though we know that doesn't actually lead to good learning. It's about, controlling the learning environment, making sure people are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And it actually ends up being counterproductive. We also see it in things like how our social welfare programs work. David Graeber's book, Utopia of Rules, talks about this, that we have a mindset of, we can't let anybody take advantage of unemployment or disability benefits. So we must make them very, very hard to get and to prove that you deserve. Even though economically, when we look at the impact of it, regulating it in that way and having all those hoops that a person has to jump through is actually more expensive than if and has a real body count. Sometimes even it can really cost people their lives too, compared to if we just trusted that if somebody is seeking assistance, they need assistance. So those are examples that are not necessarily directly answering your question, but I think you kind of see where I'm going here, where we think that we can't trust ourselves, but a lot of times we really can, and we actually do some of our best work when we do let ourselves go. So I think if you did say for yourself, okay, I'm not going to have rules imposed on myself about how productive I need to be, you probably would have a couple of weeks where you did sleep a lot and like ate snacks on the couch. And maybe that would be what you need right now to recover from a lifetime of not getting enough rest. But people have a need to feel creative, useful, productive. People want to feel like they have a mark on the world that matters. So if we don't impose kind of arbitrary and punishing rules on it, then we give people more room to actually do those things that really are a reflection of who they are and what they're passionate about. All that said, I do understand that, like, for people with like ADHD and things like that, sometimes it does really help to have a buddy who just like is like, okay, please sit down and write because you said you want to work on your novel, so I am going to help you focus. Like, it's okay to have systems in place. But I think the idea that we need to control our impulses and we can't trust ourselves to get anything done, that's what I would question. If you need to have tools to like make sure you do the things that are important to you, that's great. But also, you're not deep down lazy inside and are going to like descend into sloth forever without being corralled.
Okay, great. Now I have a question from Christina. I am a marriage and family therapist trainee, and I'm constantly setting boundaries at my nonprofit practicum site. They use the "we're a family" attitude. Do you have a go-to phrase to politely say no?
Oh, oh gosh, I need to find a good counter for the "we're a family" thing, because that's so insidious. It's kind of like culty, like love bombing, right? That like, oh, we're really close, we all love each other, that means you can have boundaries. And it's like, oh, we're a family, like, oh great, another group of people that I'm going to be worried about disappointing who are manipulative, right? Like, I find that like a lot of times we think things are impolite that actually aren't impolite. Like saying no actually is not impolite, at least in kind of American culture. Like it's not like a total faux pas to just say like, I'm not available for that. Using the language of busyness to get away with doing less is one of my favorite little hacks. So it's okay to cultivate if you need to, especially in a coercive workaholic environment, cultivate an image of, oh, I'm so scatterbrained, I'm so busy, I'm tired, I can't do this. Like, so that people won't even ask. It's okay to like, you know, throw up that smoke screen, fill up your Outlook calendar so that you can't get any invites. I think those things are fine. I think not feeling a need to explain why you're saying no and just saying I'm not available for that and not inviting further question is great. And also, the last thing I'll say is reminding yourself that even though it feels really bad to say, no, I can't do this, every time you do that, you are helping set a new norm in your workplace that makes it easier for people to say no in the future. So you're helping disrupt the toxic family cycle. And so sometimes it'll feel rude when it actually is like the most kind, loving thing you can do.
Wonderful. Okay, this is our last question from the audience. It's sometimes my choice to set boundaries results in someone else's boundaries being pushed or overrun. Do you have any advice for how to navigate situations where your boundaries might end up creating a burden for someone else?
Ooh, this is tricky. So what comes to mind here is the workplace, right? Where if you don't take something on, that task might end up falling in the lap of a coworker or someone below you even who they don't have the power to say no and they're having to kind of pick up the pieces. That's a clear-cut example to me where it really is true that you asserting your boundaries might have a ripple effect where you feel really bad, like you've impose something on someone else. For that, I think it's still important for you to stand by your boundaries because a lot of toxic workplace cultures thrive on people on creating this dynamic that makes it impossible for anyone to say no. It's like they've got us in like a weird like game theory standoff situation where if we say no, we're hurting someone else and vice versa. If it's that kind of situation, and that also happens in like activism or nonprofits, joining forces with the person who's going to be screwed over by you saying no, documenting problems, building collective power as best you can as workers to document, okay, actually the problem here isn't me saying no, it's that there's not enough people to take on all of this work. So we're all being forced to say yes on pain of like, if we say no, someone else is going to suffer. That is then what becomes the solution, which takes a lot of work. It's very difficult. It's like really kind of a long-term project, but I think it's really important. If the situation that you're asking about isn't quite that, then I would question whether it is truly you're saying no that's putting a burden on someone else. I guess like co-parenting relationships, that could kind of also be true. And then that comes time to have a new strategy and figure out how you can get additional help. But I think in a lot of other situations, it might actually just be you feeling guilty about an unfair situation that isn't actually your fault. So trying to discern between, is my no actually violating someone's boundaries or are we just both getting screwed over? I think is important to ask.
Well, thanks so much for the great talk and questions. Do you have any closing or final thoughts for us?
No, I think that's it. If people want to read any more of my writing, it's at devonprice.medium.com. I'm sure probably social things are already linked to, and that's it. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the questions, everyone.
Okay, great. And thank you all so much for attending today.